everyone, and welcome. My name is Inga Hansen. I'm the Managing Editor at Food Safety Tech, and I will be your host for today's webinar, Food and Beverage ESG, the Sustainability Mandate. We'd like to thank SGS for sponsoring this event so we can bring it to you at no cost. And we have a couple of housekeeping items before we begin. You are listening to the webinar as a webcast using GoToWebinar's app and your computer speaker system by default, so there is no call-in number. If you're having audio issues, please log out and try to reconnect. If you continue to have problems, please contact Veronica Allen via the chat box to let her know that you're having some sound issues. Today's event will include a 45-minute presentation followed by a Q&A discussion. We will also have some interactive polls happening during the presentation, and we encourage you to participate in those. You'll have the opportunity to submit text questions anytime during the presentation by typing your questions into the chat or questions pane on the control panel that you see on your screen. You can send these in at any time and we will address them at the end of the presentation. We may do some of them throughout, and anything we don't get to, we will follow up and make sure we get you an answer. You can also download the handouts for today's presentations from your control panel. You will see, if you're on a desktop, a handout pane on the right-hand side of your screen, and this will appear as a page icon on your mobile device. You will receive a link to watch the recording of this webinar on demand about 24 hours after today's event. And please make sure to check your junk or trash file if you're not seeing it and you'd like to review it or share it. The handouts will not be emailed, so do make sure that you download them during the presentation. And I'm excited to introduce you to today's speaker. Adam Hams is the ESG Director of SGS North America. Adam has 20 years of experience as a corporate ESG and sustainability consultant, author, and instructor. He's under multiple sustainability organizations. Adam earned his MBA with international education and leadership experience, integrating ESG and sustainability into business strategy. Welcome, Adam. Thanks for being here today.
Thank you, Inga. Hope you can hear me okay.
We sure.
And thanks to everyone who made time for the webinar. I know that everyone's very busy, but it's a passionate topic for me. I love talking about this stuff, so ask any questions you have. And I know that we'll try to get started just so we get the most value out of today as possible. We're going to talk very little about SGS, but then we're going to go into definitions and quick history of ESG and sustainability, the big drivers for North America, the step cycle that food and beverage firms should expect to go through, and then the kind of the meat, the material topics and KPIs, really looking at this outside in. What are the frameworks, standards, and rating agencies saying that companies should be reporting? And we'll talk about some next steps, looking at the inside out, what's actually happening in the marketplace. So we already gave me an introduction. If you haven't heard of SGS, I'll just say we're the world's leading inspection, verification, and testing and certification company in the TIC industry. We have boots on the ground around the world. And so we have, you might know us for labs, you might know us for testing, but I work in the knowledge division where we do certification, verification, and assurance. Sustainability is embedded through the company from the top to the bottom. We have a long history of participation and also helping sitting at the table to create some of these standards to make sure that they are business and industry friendly. And then we get recognized for our own performance internally managing our company in a lot of the ways that we help clients. So EcoVadis, Dow Jones, ISS, MSCI, Sustainalytics, CDP, there are more, but the ones you've heard of, we get rated by them on purpose, and we get rated very highly and consistently. So let's jump into the content. It's just nice to see where everybody's at. And so one thing that you could look at is, has your organization published an annual ESG or sustainability report? You might call it a social impact report, but basically, have you put out an annual report or even just a one-time report that summarizes all of your good work, environmental, social, governance, possibly in one place for your clients to find it? So the answers are typically yes, no, or you might not know. There are some companies that if they haven't published it very well internally, if they haven't told you about it, perhaps you don't know, but that's typically less popular. So we'll give it a few more seconds for people to answer, but it is a really nice milestone to just see where you're at in your process. And we'll talk about how important that is as we move forward. So I think now we're going to show the results. So that's pretty typical. We've got a good balance of yes, no's, and a few I don't knows. I would recommend check out your website. you can always just Google the name of your company ESG report or the name of your company sustainability report. But it is a milestone for a reason. It takes a lot of work to do the first one, and then it's usually easier after that, which we'll talk about later. So ESG and sustainability, what does it actually mean? I want to actually make sure we're talking about the same things, because the reality is people can use the words and they might mean anything. They can be used very frivolously, and we're going to speak very specifically about what we mean and why. So at the root of ESG, it just means non-financial reporting. And it typically comes from publicly traded companies. And we'll talk about the reason why ESG is used. It's just 3 buckets for non-financial reporting. It's almost never and should never be in a vacuum without the financials close by for comparison. But what are the material topics in environment, social, and governance? And here's a few listed, energy, water, waste, human rights, labor, safety, board governance, diversity, independence, executive compensation. All these things are just considered ESG because they are non-financial. Anything without a dollar sign or a currency in front of it actually falls under ESG if it's in your annual reporting. So why is that, and where did ESG come from? I'm not going to bore you with too much history, but I'll just give you a quick snippet that everything pre-1930 was historical cost accounting. This is the financial industry itself. Everything was about accuracy. And then what happened? The Great Depression, worldwide economic ripples through all the society. And so what happened was, if I give some United States examples, the Committee on Accounting Principles decided that the reforms coming out of the Great Depression meant people were not reporting the right things, and it was really a focus on more transparency and what were the material topics the company should be reporting on. So CAP, the committee, started allowing exceptions for the first time to historical cost accounting. Then you take another 10 years, things didn't move very quickly. The Accounting Principles Board replaced CAP, and they started saying, now there's too many exceptions, we've got to standardize this process. Anything that's non-GAAP, generally accepted accounting principles, anything that's non-GAAP, these exceptions have to be standardized in some way. And then it took another 10 years for them to decide what we actually need is the purpose of statements themselves to be redefined from historical cost accounting and accuracy to decision useful information for users. And what they meant by users was investors and or banks and creditors, financial institutions. So they took another 10 years to look at that and said, okay, the International Accounting Standards Board was created, and they said there are really 3 categories that we find for decision useful information that investors want, that banks want, and they typically are future discounted cash flows that help see what's the future potential for the company, and also social goals is what the terms they used at the time were social goals and environmental externalities, things that pose risks that were not easily captured with dollar signs. And what happened after that is the first shift away from tangible assets in the market valuation. So in the S&P 500, the total market valuation of that was 83% tangible, which was physical plants, vehicles, equipment, stuff that you could touch. And that's a very high percentage. And then we'll come back to that later, but that was the beginning of a shift. And then in 1980, in the US, for instance, was the first time they actually added the mandatory regulatory filings requirements for management commentary and management decision and discussion and analysis. And so all of that was just purely the financial industry saying, we need to be more responsible after the Great Depression. So it was a slow and steady shift towards decision useful data. And then if you layer that in with what was also happening, a separate environmental movement, a separate social activism movement, then in the 90s, it really kind of shifted. And what they needed, they said, we have to have tools and standards for businesses if they're going to actually be able to do this. So in 1994, Interface was one of the first huge companies that was publicly traded. It was a cargo company that said, we're going to use this one tool that we found called the Natural Step out of Sweden, and we're going to apply it, and we're going to become a sustainable company. And what they said was 0 negative impact on society or the planet. It was a pretty huge commitment. It's called Mission Zero. But that really kicked off a race of they needed more tools. Other companies that wanted to do what they're doing needed more tools. So in 1997, GRI, the Global Reporting Initiative, was created. It was the first standard. In 1998, these 2 economists published Fortune 100's best companies list for the first time, all using ESG criteria. In 2000, the UN created the Millennial Goals, which are just 8 goals that they thought all governments and businesses should kind of align behind. The UN Global Compact was created in 2004, and that was just for the business community. Corporate leaders identified 10 business principles. 6 of them were social, 3 environmental, 1 governance. And then we had the National Marketing Institute did a study for the first time that showed 13% of consumers, I think this was specifically 13% for the United States, were lifestyles of health and sustainability, which was kind of just a long name for there are people out there who are willing to pay more for socially and environmentally responsible products and services. And there's about 13% of the population in 2007 at that time, which has continued to grow. The Great Recession hit in 2008 from the housing market crisis. And as most people expected, there was a big slump in a lot of these kind of what people thought were feel-good things. But what was surprising was that personal health and wellness continued to climb, even though times were tough for people. And I think that really opened people's eyes to like, okay, there's something here that even is going to withstand the downturns in the economy. In 2009, we launched the Integrated Reporting Council, and it was all about, hey, if these issues are actually material to the business, we should start putting them right next to the financials in our end-of-year reporting, whereas everyone, for the most part, is almost 99%, everyone was reporting in a separate sustainability report that was more of a marketing piece. And so integrated reporting really was born in 2009, that whole concept. In 2011, SASB came out and said, hey, this is too much work for businesses. We're going to create 77 independent industry-specific kind of material lists of KPIs that we think these specific industries should be reporting. So you can skip kind of a bunch of steps and jump right to the end and say, here's a list. That's why people love it. Some people hate it for that same reason, but it is meant to shortcut the process for businesses. At that same time, those best companies that were started back in 1998 were evaluated by another economist, and they were actually outperforming the market by 2 to 3%. And that another thing that opened people's eyes of like, hey, there's performance issues also possibly at play here. In 2016, BlackRock, huge investment body around the world, said for the first time, hey, we're going to start looking for ESG integrated into your portfolios. There were no requirements at the time. They said, we're just going to be looking for ESG integration. And at that time, 2020, shortly after, that 83% tangible market valuation in the S&P 500 had completely flipped around, and 90% of market valuation in the S&P 500 was all intangible, which is intellectual property, brand value, and goodwill. All things, except for maybe the intellectual property, that can disappear quite quickly. And so if there's negative PR, if there's negative environmental action, social action, a lot of actual market value disappears quickly, and people and investors really took a strong look at that. And then 2022, the last one I'll mention before we jump off of this history lesson, is that the World Economic Forum every year interviews and surveys some of the largest business leaders around the world, and they say, what are your #1 economic risks to society and to the economy? And they said economic risk, climate was #1, COVID was #2. And so people are continuing to see this as a major issue, environmental and social. And what was missing, which isn't missing as much before, was business tools and standards. And now we're more haggling over, are the business tools and standards needing to be fine-tuned and improved? So what does that mean? If people say ESG, there are 2 very different things. Financial materiality, ESG purely at its core is the impact to the business. It is, if there's an environmental issue, does that impact the business's profitability? If there's a social issue, does that impact the business's profitability? So ESG is on its face, very kind of bottom of the pyramid. There are other things I would refer to them as sustainability. They're more, some people call it double materiality, or you're adding in impact materiality. That is more of social activism, environmental performance for society, for the planet, and that's both. Double materiality is when you're measuring the impacts to the business and the impacts of the business on the world around it. And so if you hear things like CSRD in Europe and GRI, Global Reporting Initiative, which we'll talk about in a second, they're really double materiality sustainability, while everything else is kind of an investor-driven business proposal. And what has happened in a big way in the last just 3 to 4 years, integrated reporting, SASB, and TCFD, that's specifically a climate standard, they all merged into what was called the Value Reporting Foundation, and that has since merged recently into IFRS, which is the International Financial Reporting Standards body around the world. And they actually just 2 months ago launched 2 new standards that summarize all of it. So basically IFRS S1 and S2 have replaced several standards that came before it and integrated the best of them and got rid of some things. And so we're always looking for alignment and simplification for businesses, where GRI is not giving up the double materiality approach for the impact materiality, but they are doing what SASB did, which is adding sector-specific standards to help industries shortcut the process and say, hey, if you're in this industry, we've done the materiality assessment for you, just download our sector guidance. Whereas the UN Sustainable Development Goals have always been pretty government focused, but they're launching something called SDG Impact for the business community, which is also very sustainability, kind of good for you, good for the planet, good for society type of stuff. But there's a pretty clear line between ESG, what's good for the business and what are investors asking for, versus sustainability, which is kind of taking it a step further and sometimes multiple steps further. So I said a lot of things, but polling question, what's most important for you is not understanding history, but what are you seeing now? What trends is your business seeing in your stakeholder expectations, whether it's for ESG or sustainability performance? Are you seeing nothing, no change? Is it increasing or is it decreasing? And it maybe you think it's even fluctuating and it's changing every year, but there is no off the shelf, and I would never recommend an off the shelf understanding or approach to ESG and sustainability. Ultimately, you can take a lot of guidance out there, but you've got to do something that's right for your business. So the question is really important for you to assess. Again, another milestone. What are you seeing? What's the trend for your organization? And what kind of expectations do your stakeholders have? What we see here is a lot of none or no change, about 17%, which is actually quite high for normal, what I typically see, but it's absolutely valid. And decreasing, what's nice is like nobody's decreasing and a lot of people seeing an increase. What's important is now that you're seeing an increase, do you just be reactive and kind of start whatever people say you should be doing, you just kind of jump and react? And I would say no, there's a very systematic approach to take, and it depends on what your drivers are. So we're going to talk about the food and beverage industry, but it's very similar. And it might surprise you, might not, but the number one driver continues to be, and has been for a long time, these investor ESG related ratings. And therefore investors and creditors specifically, they're leaning on these because they want to make decisions in their financial portfolios. And these are important because they're making buy, sell, and lend decisions based off of these ratings sometimes wholly or in part. They might index to it, but then they also have their own custom ratings. But the big ones are Dow Jones, MSCI, ISS, Sustainalytics, and now EcoVadis. The big difference between EcoVadis, you can see it's 100,000 reporters today, is that it is not just for publicly traded companies. We'll talk about that next. And it's semi-private. But all these others, DJSI, MSCI, ISS, Sustainalytics, they are scraping publicly available information that has been reported and rating companies, often with minimal to a little bit of feedback, but it's just whatever's publicly available, you get a score. And companies didn't respond very well to that at the beginning. There's been a lot more engagement and a lot more alignment with transparency, but it's still sort of a closed box system that a lot of people complain about. And honestly, if you look at some of what people are calling the ESG backlash, a lot of the lawsuits that do exist that have validity are somewhere in this area where they're looking at, you need to be transparent with this methodology, this algorithm, and we need to know that these are actually material topics for our company. So that's big publicly traded companies for the most part. Here, what's called the second wave is really what's happening today, and what you might be feeling is the supply chain customer push into their supply chain. So those big brands are getting scored. Now they're pushing and trying to improve their scores and improve how happy their investors are and their customers and their employees by saying we need to have transparency and help manage improvements in our supply chain. As an example, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol with climate change used to be scope 3 emissions, which are supply chain optional. But since ISO has come out with 14064-1, it's actually the second version of it, 2018. It is not optional anymore. Supply chain emissions are required, at least to do a risk assessment and include significant emissions in the supply chain. That's happening in a lot of standards where supply chain is becoming expected, not optional. And what you see are the large brands using platforms, there are thousands of them, to request or softly mandate that their suppliers disclose either directly greenhouse gas emissions, which is CDP, or larger, broader sets of data, which is ESG. And EcoVadis is probably the most popular. It's not probably, it is. Out of 13,000 CDP reporters, 23 big brands are actually joined in what's called a supply chain member, which 23 of those big brands have agreed to ask their entire supply chain to start reporting in CDP. And then EcoVadis, which is bigger and broader, there are multiple, I think there are 10 or 11 industry initiatives. The food and beverage initiative is called Progress. And there are 8 major food and beverage brands in that have also agreed, not just for climate data, but they want their whole supply chain to report through EcoVadis environmental, social, and governance data. And so that is really moving and shifting to small, medium-sized companies that are privately held, which were not subject to any of the previous ratings before. We have something called an ESG rating boost help. If you check with SGS, we're a huge company. We have tons of great services, but I'll just throw it in there that we do help companies directly try to improve their score. But you want to actually look at your broader strategy as well. Regulations might surprise people, maybe not, but in North America, they're definitely third. That's because we don't have a lot of regulation with teeth. We have a lot of proposed regulation. So if your supply chain is huge and you're a supplier to Europe or South America or East Asia, you might actually be hit by some of these CSRD, as in the European Union. Brazil has a very strong greenhouse gas program, but Canada and the US both have a national greenhouse gas reporting program for mandatory reporters. Those are your big, really, really big emitters. But they have federal supplier climate rules, both proposed and that are in comment period, that everyone pretty much expects to be passed, because they're going to ask suppliers to the government of a certain size to mandatory report their emissions, scope 1 and 2 if you're smaller, scope 3, and setting science-based targets if you're a very large supplier. And then there's the SEC in the United States, the SEC climate rule, which is going to take at least a year in the courts, but that's proposed for all publicly traded companies, again, only to disclose greenhouse gases, not broader things. So if you look all around the world, this is pretty consistent. ESG is picking up, but climate rules are much faster. The standards and the tools and the measurement is all standardized and aligned so well that everyone is jumping on board. Most regulation is climate related at this point. And then these are a distant fourth and fifth, is that if you have consumers, if you're selling directly to consumers, you're going to have a lot of that low-cost consumer pressure that we talked about. There's a huge and growing market. What once was 13% in the US is 23%, and it's growing about 10% per year. Obviously not 10%. It's not going to be 33% next year. It's 10% of that 23%, but it's a $546 billion market around the globe today. And McKinsey, who surveys consumers and companies every year, found even higher numbers, that 70% of consumers say they're willing to pay more for green products that perform as well as other products. And the big thing is 50% of companies say that their actual business growth is driving sustainability initiatives. So not that they're trying to be more sustainable themselves necessarily, but they're entering new markets with sustainably focused or sustainable bent, socially progressive or environmentally responsible products and services. And actually it's the business growth and expansion that they're looking at, why sustainability is important for them. And last, but I don't say this lightly, I think it's gonna be something to continue to watch, especially for higher level knowledge positions where you're trying to get people to move to work somewhere, or they're very competitive and they have a lot of choices. That surveys are showing that most employees, 83%, employers are not doing enough, or that they would actually prefer working for a different company that had a better record. IBM's 2022 IBV survey, which they do every year, is actually 16,000 employees in 10 countries. 67% said they're more willing to apply for and accept positions with sustainable companies. Obviously, caveat, that's probably not for hourly workers. and low wage positions, but it does become more of an issue when you're trying to get upper level, hire to recruit talent. Again, said more things, I like to stop. All of those are possible drivers. The mix for you is what's important. Your organization and what is impacting you. So what is your organization's #1 driver for ESG and sustainability performance? Could be ratings, could be supply chain customers, regulations, consumers, employees, or something other. And if you have other, I encourage you to put it in the chat, but do select it and say, hey, I think it's something else for us, because it's really important. Again, nothing off the shelf. You shouldn't just adopt something because somebody else did it. Even looking within your industry, not every company is the same. There's different ownership models, different structures. You might have vertical integration. So all of these are incredibly helpful tools, but they're not the answer for every single company. So what is your #1 driver, in your opinion, for your organization? So the answers are, oh, I need to expand this a little bit so I can see. Looks like supply chain, customers, and then consumers are the highest, which makes a lot of sense in the food and bev industry, but you can see that there's employees and others. There's also regulations, ESG ratings. So there's a nice mix. The reality for yourself is you'll probably have 2, maybe 3, but you need to know which ones are more of a priority. What's actually #1? What's actually #2? Because it's going to depend, it's going to determine any kind of strategic decisions that you make, creating an ESG program or driving your goals and how aggressive they're going to be. So let's talk about that process. You're a food and bev company. What are you going to actually do to implement some of this stuff and take action? There's really, it's overly simplified, but these 5 steps are very important, and this is the maturity cycle for any ESG and sustainability program. First, you have to build awareness. You have to have an understanding of the issues, trends, and strategies that affect not only your region, your industry, and your company, and then you can prioritize. You can set those priorities once you have a great awareness, and usually it's called a materiality assessment with some stakeholder engagement, but what you're doing is getting a very broad view of which of these topics are actually material to the business, and are they material because they're a risk, a negative, an opportunity, a positive, or possibly both, depending on which way it goes. And then with those priorities, you can flush out an entire strategy with vision, KPIs, goals, planning, and then you actually execute initiatives, projects, and quality management. You're going to do day-to-day business stuff that's kind of boring, but is also some of the more exciting projects because it does have some of that appeal to other consumers, to employees, to the market. And last, we'll choose at some point to do formal reporting. Typically what people report on is both their management approach to sustainability and ESG and each of those material topics, but also performance. People want to know how you're doing over time and have actual KPIs and measurement. And that first time you go through this project or this cycle, it could take 2 years, 3 years, but once you get through it, especially if you start to create an annual report, it becomes a lot smoother, a lot easier, and you kind of almost are naturally going to be on a 1-year cycle, whatever that 12-month period is, where you're going to put out a report, you're going to review, and you're going to go back to awareness, check your priorities, adjust your strategy, execute, and then report again at the end of the year. So here's an example. Here's a beverage company that you might have heard of, Coca-Cola. If you look in their report, it's a much, much longer report, but I pulled out some highlights that they talk about this very same thing. What are those 3 first steps? They identify the leadership and the governance. Who is that senior kind of ESG committee that's going to determine, raise awareness about all these trends and issues, and then conduct a materiality assessment. And this is a pretty common visual. Here are all the topics rated to the top right, what's important to the company and what's important to their stakeholders so that they can prioritize. And then they actually flush out a strategy with very specific kind of siloed issues that they're going to focus on and what are the KPIs under each of those issues. That report is probably almost 100 pages long, but Coca-Cola has been doing this for a very long time. We've seen 10-page reports, 12-page reports. That's very common when you first start out. Here's Dannon. Here's a food industry, very similar. You've got a governance structure in their report. They look at, here's our actual governance structure, and here's how ESG and sustainability is filtered in. They talk about the different mechanisms for managing those material topics. Then they look at materiality, another matrix that you're going to get used to seeing if you're in this industry. they kind of color code them, and they also have an interesting like size for different reasons of impact, but they have a very strong and visual material setting of like, this is why we chose to focus on certain things. And here they have this beautiful visual of, hey, we've got 3 categories. Under each category we've actually got 4, 5 priorities, 3 priorities, and then you go into and they have multiple pages on each one of these with KPIs. And so that, don't get overwhelmed, because these companies have been doing it for possibly 10, 15 years. But when you start out, you'll have the same approach to identify your topics and start building a strategy. And the reason these are color coded is because they're very different people. The sequence is also mitigating the risk. At the beginning, you have the senior level kind of group that is internal leadership. They're having a lot of sometimes uncomfortable conversations behind closed doors about social and environmental topics, and they have to say some things matter more than others. We are going to do some things, we aren't going to do other things. And then no one really has to know about that until you start executing. But your employees and your internal business partners that are very close to you will start to see you doing business differently. And ultimately, when you report, especially if it's a public report, it will be available for everybody, and you have to be ready for that to be picked up by different people and kind of spun different ways. So it's very important that you take reporting seriously, and when you start putting out an annual report, you know that you're very happy with it, because all external stakeholders will then have access to it. And those types of people are very different. We call them strategists in the first 3. It's usually your senior ESG committee or your senior sustainability working group, however you want to call it, board, C-suite, VPs and directors, often lead counsel. And if you have a dedicated ESG professional, they need to be on it. But then you've got implementers. These are the people that actually run an energy program or actually run a safety program. And there will be different people, and they're kind of siloed, but there will be project managers, operations managers, subject matter experts, risk and quality managers. It's really just business as usual and needs to be treated as a core business initiative. But reporters, you're going to have a different team, that you got to have some internal communications people for your employees, external marketing people for your sales and your business partners. But you also have investor relations, government affairs, and legal compliance. And there are risks to reporting, and so you have to make sure that whatever report you put out is meeting the needs of all those stakeholders simultaneously. So that's, again, a lot of stuff, but the important part is, for you today, you came to this webinar to get some value. What steps of the ESG cycle fit strongest? Maybe you cross lots of boundaries, but what fits strongest with your current job role? Are you a strategist that might actually be sitting at the table creating the strategy for the whole company? Are you an implementer that's going to be day-to-day making things work and then sending your data up to the reporting team? Or are you a reporter? Are you going to be making sure that the output or the outcome and the storytelling to these different stakeholders is done in the most successful way possible for the company? Typically, you might have, if you're an ESG director or a vice president of sustainability, or if you're the one person asked to sort of coordinate everything, you might be that hub in the middle who has to talk to the strategist, has to work with the implementers, and has to be on the reporting team. But that's pretty much the only position that is on all 3. So we got a lot of strategists here, some implementers, as well as reporters. So that's a nice balance. But strategists, I'm glad we have a high level, 47%. That it needs to come first. You cannot be in the middle of the company and create a strategic plan for the company. It has to come from the top, because the leadership of the company is the one who are going to integrate ESG and sustainability into your core business practices. If not, it just becomes another kind of side project, and it's not traditionally known as ESG. That's just more of like a project you're doing on the side, and it will not get you the results that you're looking for. We do have great training. Some is actually coming up in a few weeks, but we offer it quarterly. Our training is based on role-based leadership. So we want strategists to have a class, a one-day course, people who execute and implementers to have a full-day course, and reporters to have a full-day course. You can take all of them, or you can take one of them. And we do have a video on demand foundation course that's just all the history and definitions and drivers. That's a really good starting point. What all that gets you is, if you know your role, is you eventually have to do something. And I'm gonna go back a second and just say, what we try to do here is summarize all the topics and KPIs for you that are most relevant on average for food and bev, and we can show the differences. but there's a lot of things to pull from. We try to average it across several rating systems, standards, and frameworks. You would be better served, and one of the things we do with clients is we actually identify what are the standards, frameworks, and rating agencies that actually impact you, if at all, and then you would develop your own set of topics and KPIs. But just to give you a sense of the ecosystem here, processed food, we took a very specific one, processed food and non-alcoholic beverages. And there's very strong alignment here. So governance is almost the number one thing that especially investors want to see. They want to know that you're managing this and you're doing your own due diligence. So what's the senior governance structure that you have in place? What's their name and qualifications? Have you conducted a stakeholder engagement process? Please list and describe your material topics. And then do you have certification to a governance standard like ISO 27001, ISO 37001? And then also, are your tier 1 suppliers certified to any governance standard, and which types? And this is where you really get into those supply chain issues. Social next for food and bev is product safety and quality. It's really about the stuff itself because it's going into people's bodies. So they look at certification to a food safety standard, and there's a lot of them, but a lot of GFSI recognized standards, including FSSC, which just I think rolled out a new version, SQF and BRCGS. There's other certifications like GMP, HACCP, FSMA, ISO 22000. These are all great food safety standards, but they're industry specific. The thing that you choose, you don't have to have them all, but people are looking that you have a standard, and the standards are one of the fastest way to give you credentials and third-party verification. And ingredients, again, looking at suppliers. So what ingredients do you have that are coming from tier 1 suppliers certified to one of those food safety standards above? They also often want to know, especially if they're an investor, any audits you've done with major and minor non-conformance rates, safety violations and corrections, and also recalled food products and beverages. So those are the types of things people want to see. These are fair, hopefully you're seeing these are not crazy out of left field things. These are pretty business as usual. And that tends to be the case when you're in these investor-driven standards. Product health and nutrition. What about your customers? They're going to put this in their body, but is it actually not going to hurt them? But is it helping them? Are there positive outcomes? Often people talk about that as product health and nutrition as like the next step beyond safety. So they ask for things like revenue from any products labeled or marketed for its health and nutritional benefits, management of health and nutrition risks and opportunities like sugar, you can name the big ones like sugar, gluten, sodium, the things that people are tracking to say like, oh, these have certain health risks. If they're on product labels, they're typically, you've heard of them. They're often asking about advertising to children, especially if it's related to dietary guidelines, any revenues from products labeled as GMO and non-GMO, and then any actual financial incidents that you had from non-compliance with labeling. Then you can see climate is not number 1, but it came down at number 4. There's one that's in green or in orange below that's actually separate for beverages, but it's pretty consistent. People want to know energy consumed both from the grid and from renewables. Often you'll do a product level carbon footprint, especially if you have one product that sells a much higher volume or a much higher revenue than any other. Oftentimes companies will not do an organizational footprint, they'll do a product footprint. Or you'll do an organizational footprint, which is scope 1, 2, and 3 greenhouse gas emissions. And then did you certify that to a climate standard? Did you follow ISO 14064-1? If it's product, did you follow ISO 14067? And are you reporting to something like CDP? And then in the supply chain, it's do you have any tier 1 suppliers certified to a climate standard as well? The beverage companies, I'm not sure why it's so different. I think processed food definitely distributes and hauls a lot of things too, but consumption of renewable fleet fuel is something that gets asked a little more of the beverage companies versus the food companies. We do have some of the best, I'm not joking, some of the best greenhouse gas training around. We train a lot of our clients and competitors as well, but we do just believe in it and we need it to get out there. We have one is like an intro, again, these are all day courses. We have an intro, if just people learning. We have one for all quantification of doing emissions inventories. We have one for verification. If your team wants to get verified, you're going to need to understand what that process looks like. And if you actually want to become a verifier, you take all 4 days. And these are the kind of people we we either hire ourselves or they actually just want to be that good and they manage maybe a lot of facilities within their own company. But those are modular courses. You can take all or none, and that's what we offer. I did see a question. It says, where do things like no forced labor in the supply chain fit into this model? I thought that was part of the social grouping. That's great. So great question. So I hope you noticed that it says environmental, but then I give you a topic. So I'm trying to help you see the ESG breakdown, but we're going to get to more social. So as we go back, for instance, the first one was governance. That's really itself. It's the only topic. Social, product safety and quality is a social topic. Product health and nutrition is social. Climate is environmental. Now we're going to talk about packaging, which is environmental. We'll also get to some social, but they're not. There are going to be other social compliance, like regulatory compliance pieces that we'll talk about. Packaging for food and beverages is really big. People want to know, is it how much of your packaging is recycled or renewable materials in the actual product itself? And then is that packaging recyclable, reusable, or compostable after it's been used by the user for end of life? And then management of life cycle environmental impacts of packaging. Water is a pretty big deal, especially regionally, depending on where you're located. But if you're taking water as a beverage company, or if you're processing food, you often need a lot of processed water. So any ingredients sourced from regions with high or extremely high water stress, water withdrawn or consumed from regions with high or extremely high water stress, and then any non-compliance with water quality permits, standards, or regulations, water management risks and risk mitigation strategies and practices. The big safety one, which is last, I hate to put it last, I'm just telling you what the frameworks and standards and rating agencies are showing. It's on the list, but it's further down the list. It's really where workforce safety and incident rates come in, certification to social standards like 45001 and SMETA, and then also in your supply chain, which I can't stress this enough, just because it's listed as one line item, that's a lot of work to survey and collect the documentation from all of your tier 1 suppliers, let alone tier 2 suppliers, to get that transparency and traceability. But they want to know, have you surveyed your tier 1 suppliers, and are they certified to any social standards? Are there any risks in your supply chain? And typically it comes up first around employee health and safety. It could be also supply chain workers, you call it worker health and safety. That's where a lot of these human rights violations come into. It's sort of a broad topic, but you get into each one of these industry by industry, and you'll find, wage theft, age, like underage workers. It does become very specific pretty fast. I couldn't put that all in one slide, but it's a very great question you came up with. I had another question. Thank you. Do you see different priorities and strategies in private companies? Does reporting look differently from them? That would go way back to the beginning where I said it depends on what your drivers are. If your drivers are supply chain, big customers in the supply chain putting pressure on you, your reporting is going to look very similar to the public companies, because they're going to be asking for similar things that roll up into their numbers. So a good way of saying that is the total of all the suppliers' data, this is why they want them on a software system, all adds up to one number for that big brand, and that's their supply chain impact. So your numbers get thrown in with all the other suppliers, and they add up to the brand's total or final result. And so that's what they're looking for, and that's where it's being driven. If it's other issues that is not kind of investor scoring from big brands pressure, then it could be very specific, and you just follow the drivers, whatever the stakeholder is. That's why stakeholder engagement is so vital, is that they will tell you exactly what they're looking for. And if they're unhappy because they're not seeing something from you, they'll tell you exactly what it is, and you can focus your attention on that one thing or those three things. Whereas if it's really coming from a public pressure standpoint, then you're going to have broader issues, and the frameworks and the standards are actually going to be your best friend, and you should start there, especially with IFRS S1 and S2. The SASB standards, the 77 different industry standards, they're very easy to use, and they're a great starting place. A quick question, again, I talk a lot, but I really want you to think about how this actually applies to your business. Has your organization conducted a formal materiality assessment? Another way of saying that could be, has your organization conducted any stakeholder engagement? Have you have you done a pretty in-depth process? And I don't see that the, Inga, can you put up the poll? I don't think it's popping up.
Yep, up there you go.
Oh, there we go, thank you. No worries, I just want people to be able to answer. And so have you conducted one? Because for you, that's really where the juice is. We can talk about frameworks and standards, and they're all incredibly helpful tools, which I will always say, but they're tools, and you have to use those tools to help determine what is material for your business and then focus on that. It doesn't help to just adopt all of it because there's way too much. You can never make everybody happy. A materiality assessment is your best way to sift through and just find the gold, the gold nuggets in all of this for your business, and then benefit from those and move forward. So yes, you have, no, you haven't, or maybe you don't know. I showed you that matrix. Usually the result is some sort of matrix, an XY axis where you're mapping your actual topics. So that's pretty good, 29% at yes, still the majority at no, and a lot of folks that I don't know. I will say, unfortunately, it's sort of proprietary information, but it's fascinating information. A lot of companies, when they put out their first ESG reports and their sustainability reports, they put that material assessment and that matrix into their report. And it's one of the most fascinating things I love to see. It's very educational for you, but it's also educational for your competitors. Some of them pull it out of their report and actually don't put it in there in the future unless they revise it and they just want to explain why they changed some of their reporting. But the next polling question is, have you gotten any third-party assurance of your ESG and sustainability reporting? So not only putting out a report, which I know that not everyone here has, but often it's very limited. You might have only gotten third-party assurance for your greenhouse gas emissions because climate is a big deal. You might not have done your full report. You might have only done a few, like 5 or 6 KPIs that you thought were really material, and the rest were, I don't want to say fluff, but just not as a priority. And it costs money to get third-party assurance. So maybe you said, hey, well, let's get the big ones. Some people do their entire report. They want it to be GRI compliant or SASB compliant, or just no, you've never gotten third-party assurance, or you don't know if you've gotten any third-party assurance. But basically, third-party assurance is late in the game, and it doesn't surprise me that the majority is no, the majority is I don't know. My hat is off to you who have done it. Yes, it's a advanced step, but it provides your team confidence that you're doing it correctly to the standard that you're intending to meet, because you don't want to get any greenwashing claims against you later. And you just want to believe that the data you're using to make business decisions is accurate. You don't want to base a whole 10-year, 15-year strategy on faulty data that's inaccurate, because it's going to really affect you later. So that does not surprise me. We do have KPI verification and assurance services. This isn't a big sales presentation. And I also want to tell you, I mentioned earlier at the beginning, we're doing a lot of outside in today. We're telling you, what do the rating agencies say? What do the frameworks and standards say? And I will say, it's not throwaway stuff. Those are, every one of those is using industry feedback. There's multiple stakeholder working groups. But I think what's also very important, which we're looking at, and we hope to launch this early in 2024, the food and beverage industry is one that we're looking at, the top 50 to 100 companies. We're going to show what's actually happening. Yes, the frameworks and the standards and the ratings say this, but what is actually occurring? What are the reporting behaviors of these companies? And we're going to be, please tune in early next year. We hope to have this all done with copious amounts of data to look at and say, this is what's actually happening on the ground. And it's also incredibly helpful decision-making data for you to look at. But with that, I want to save at least the last 10 minutes and say, I try to cover a ton of data. ESG is a huge topic, not just for food and bev, but what questions do you have? I'll answer everything that I can in the next 10 minutes. And if you want to email me after this, I'll answer even more. But Inga, thank you for running the back end.
Oh, thank you, Adam. And I also, we are going to welcome another speaker from SGS who can address any food-specific topics. So I wanted to welcome Mohit McLaren, who is the sales manager for pharma food training and personal care at SGS North America. He has over a decade of technical audit and sales consultancy experience. And again, as I mentioned, he can address any food-related questions that you might have. And we do have some questions coming in. If you still have time to add your questions to the question box, and if we don't get to you today, we will follow up. So question for Adam, if we haven't received any requests from big customers in the supply chain to report on CDP or EcoVadis, do we need to worry about it?
It's a great question. If you haven't received any yet, the thing that I would encourage you to do is go look at the EcoVadis website and maybe just type in EcoVadis supply chain, no, EcoVadis industry initiatives, and find food and beverage, because right now there are 8 major brands. If your customers look like them, you might want to check it out because they're moving quickly. I showed you EcoVadis has 100,000 reporters. It's because they're growing at the fastest rate of any rating agency, of any platform. They're kind of blowing everyone out of the water, and I don't see anything really competing with them from a number standpoint. But for that reason, brands are jumping on board competitively as well, saying like, oh, my competitor's on this, I want to be on it too. And so I wouldn't write it off. I would at least go look at the EcoVadis Industry Initiatives page for food and bev. It's called the Progress Initiative, and just see what you think, because it's very possible that it could be a risk that someone very soon will send you an EcoVadis survey if you haven't received it yet.
Mm-hmm. Great, and this is another question that has to do with, so do we move now or wait and see where things are going? Do you recommend waiting until the new SEC and federal supplier rules are adopted before you get started taking action?
I mean, I'm biased. I say never wait for regulation. You can't knee-jerk reaction to everything, but the SEC ruling, I haven't met anyone that thinks it's not going to be adopted, but with modifications. So I would at least familiarize yourself with the SEC ruling. It's specifically on climate disclosure. It's not on anything else. But if you look at that climate disclosure ruling, it behooves you to look at your footprint, and you would never be ill-served getting your first carbon footprint or your greenhouse gas emissions inventory. And look at there's some sizes of, if you're this size of company, it's like a 3-year time frame. You've got a lead in, depending on how big you are. But the bigger you are as a company, I would at least go look at that standard itself, or the ruling, and understand it so that you can prepare yourself for it. I wouldn't just wait till it passes and then try to react.
Like a catch up, yes. And we had a question about auditing with the standards. Does the auditing look similar to GFI schemes, or for example, the site visit auditing and schedules?
I assume, are we referring to the greenhouse gas audits, or just any audits?
I think we can ask, and it's actually Amanda, if she wants to follow up and let us know. I think she sent this in while we were talking about EcoVadis and CDPs.
Oh, so the EcoVadis is very different. I don't know that it's a full audit. It's a self-reporting platform. EcoVadis is actually 2 things. It's a self-reporting platform for companies, but it also is a service where it helps you send surveys. Once you're on the system, you can send surveys very easily to your supply chain for all kinds of things. So customized surveys, but the actual scoring mechanism that gives you a score, which is you get an E, S, and G score and a supply chain score, 4 different, and they all roll up into one composite score. They give you an industry comparison of where are you in your industry? Are you a laggard or a leader? But what it is a bunch of questions that are customized to your industry, but they're environmental questions, social questions, and governance questions. You do most of the self-reporting, and then you have to upload some documentation, and their audit is mostly, to my understanding, unless something's changed dramatically, a lot of it is still just desk. They look at your documentation and take it at face value. And for that reason alone, and the fact that it's private, if I was just Joe Schmo from Iowa and I Googled your name, I could not get your EcoVadis score, but I can easily go get your MSCI score or your ISS score or your Sustainalytics score. So EcoVadis is popular with reporters because it's semi-private and it is also self-reporting. There's not an extra expense, but if you want a third-party audit, that will improve your score. So you get scored higher if you have third-party. verification.
Mhm. And the question, are the materiality assessments really necessary, given that, I guess like many of this, there is an extra cost to all of these?
I mean, to me, I think yes, for the reasons I said, but you can adjust. I do think that what's available today, which was never available before, is so many people in your industry and industry collectively have kind of like industry associations have done them. The SASB standards are still a great starting place, but you don't want to just adopt them off the shelf. I would say still look at them and decide. The thing that's usually missing that makes it really hard if you don't do a materiality assessment that's more formal is that stakeholder engagement piece. You actually go out and talk to your stakeholders that you as a business determine for yourself are material stakeholders, that they have a significant influence over you or they are impacted by your business or both. And therefore you engage with them and find out what ESG topics do they think you should be working on and why. And that really informs more than any downloadable PDF. It's actually very specific to your company. You're building relationships with those stakeholders at the same time. They're telling you exactly what kind of communications they want in the reporting phase of this. So although it can be expensive, I cannot undervalue what you're going to get out of that and how useful that's going to be, not just for the next 5 years, but maybe for the next 10 years. And so they are expensive, but you can also you can take like a smaller version. And we do really small ones called ESG health checks, but those are more for supply chain partners, and they're very, very rough. They're not nearly as in depth. They don't have stakeholder engagement, and then we can do more. But you can get away with doing less, but you get less, is my only answer.
And I have a question, and I'm not sure which one of you I should ask, but it does seem a little bit food related here. Are there certain components of the farm to fork food industry that you're seeing more focus from either regulators or investors in terms of looking at social concerns, environmental concerns that companies should be moving on?
Mohit, do you see anybody coming from specific sectors that are more verbal, more outspoken about it?
Yes, we certainly do, and we're seeing a huge trend take place in 2023, where a lot of the large retailers are, they have a very robust supply chain program, and they started to implement ESG as part of their mandate. A lot of them are looking for strategic champions within their supply chain to take leadership in that position. But what we have noticed is a very strong emphasis on the social aspect to start with, because the environmental aspect is quite heavily covered as far as the food safety audits are concerned. So GFSI has a very strong structure and audit protocols with respect to water conservation, water management, and water testing and water protection. So that part is relatively well covered off in the food safety audit. The social aspect is not. We're seeing a massive demand kick in this year from pick the top 5 retailers in the industry. So we're definitely seeing a drive in that direction, and it's all designed around protocols to risk manage their supply chain better.
Mm-hmm. Great, and we are coming up on the hour. So I want to thank you, Adam and Mohit, for being here with us and for the wonderful presentation. And I want to also thank everyone who joined us today. We so appreciate your time, and wanted to just remind you to, one, you will be getting a follow-up link if you'd like to view this or share this within the next 24 hours. Also, if you go to foodsafetytech.com, you can see all of our upcoming and on-demand webinars and in-person events. So we encourage you to visit that, and hope you all have a wonderful rest of your Monday.
Thank you, everyone, for attending. And
Thanks,
thank you,
everyone.
Inga.